Hi, good morning, everybody. So good to see all of you here, and thank you for being so early. A lot of you were logged on and ready to go about an hour ago, so thank you for your patience as we got everybody into the breakout room, into the Zoom room. Thank you for making the time in your schedule, in your day today, to be here, to learn with us together and to listen to two incredible speakers and two incredible musicians who we have in our agenda today. Also, huge thank you to the diocesan support staff who has given our Reconciliation Task Force the opportunity to work on this Education Day, and for all of their technical support. It takes a village to have a practical Zoom room. We're going to ask all of you to mute yourselves. That's the button on the left-hand side of bottom left of your screen. And to stop your video, that will help with the bandwidth. And then on the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom room, if you put yourself in speaker view rather than gallery or full screen, you should have an easier time seeing our speakers. To begin our day this morning, I would like to ask Bob Steele, who is a member of our Reconciliation Task Force, if he would give us our opening prayer. Bob.
What I would like to do as our opening prayer is to start with a collect by the Reverend Absalom Jones, who was the first African-American Episcopal priest in our church, and then close with a prayer, social justice from our Book of Common Prayer. Absalom Jones, who, as I mentioned, was the first African-American priest, in her sermon, the Reverend Dr. Paula Murray, who was the first African-American female priest in our church. Well, actually, she was the first female priest in the Episcopal Church. In her sermon, she opened her sermon with the following statement, which I think is very appropriate for our meeting reconciliation this morning. She said, referring to Jones, his life and ministry stands as a powerful Christian witness in the never-ending human struggle toward liberation and reconciliation. The prayer for social justice. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving spirit may move every human heart, and especially the people who live here in Honolulu, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, hatreds cease, and that all of our divisions heal. May we live in justice and peace through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Again. Good morning again, folks.
I am so grateful to see all of you here, again, as Jazzy said. And what I'm hoping to do at this time is to go over our schedule for the day and talk a little bit about the time that we'll spend together. But before we do that, I would like to take an opportunity to introduce our reconciliation task force. And we've all met Bob Steele already this morning. Thank you, Bob, for that wonderful prayer. And on the task force, we also have B. Fitzpatrick as a member, Mary Carpenter, Jeannie Cooper, and Auntie Kala Holden, as well as Jazzy and myself. And it was such a wonderful process being able to gather over the weeks with this group and talk about the issues at hand and work out what would be best for us to present today. And it's such an incredible group, and I'm just so grateful for all the work that they put into this day and bringing all of this together for us. So again, thank you to our folks on the Reconciliation Task Force this morning. And so I'm gonna take a moment to share my screen so I can go over the schedule for today. And so here we are, folks. We're at about 9:37, and we're going to begin at about 9:45, hopefully, with our two speakers. And in a moment, I will introduce both speakers to you. We're so grateful to have both Dr. Okamura and Dr. Glenn, who are going to be sharing with us for this first plenary session until about 10:15. And at about 10:15, we'll take a 10-minute break. And at that break time, we ask that you stay with us on the Zoom room and don't log out. And you can mute your Zoom room feature. You can mute yourself, you can stop your video, take a break, and then come back at 10:25. And at that time, we will send us out into discussion rooms. And we will have those discussion rooms. They're going to be facilitated discussions. We have some questions at hand for all of us. And I just want to let you know who the facilitators will be for these sessions. We are very, very thankful for the following people for being willing on this day to be facilitators of our discussions. And so we have Bruce DeGoyer, Diane Martinson, Bob Steele, Libby Berman, Keleave He, David Gerlach, Heather Patton Graham, Ha'ahel Gwanson, Steve Costa, Jennifer Latham, Lonnie Bowman, Jazzy, and myself serving as facilitators for our discussions. And we will have, after our discussion groups, we're going to call everyone back to the main room. And we will move into our lunchtime, our lunch break. And at that lunch break, I would like to call attention that we will be having music by John and Jamaica Osorio. So if we could think about our lunchtime together as kind of a brown bag lunch, where you can grab your lunch, come back to your screen, and enjoy the music and stories from John and Jamaica Osorio during our lunch break. And then after that, we will move into our afternoon plenary session with our two speakers again. And then following the same model as the morning, have a break, and then come into our breakout rooms. And by 1:45, we'd love to be back in our main room for the close of the day, for the prayer. So that, dear friends, is our schedule for the day. Okay. And so at this time, I would like us to introduce our two speakers. And we have, first I'd like to take time to introduce you to Dr. Akiemi Glenn. Dr. Akiemi Glenn is a Honolulu-based scholar and culture worker. She holds an MA and PhD in linguistics from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and a BA in linguistics from New York University. With genealogical ties to forest and coastal areas currently known as North Carolina and Virginia, her research considers the interplay of space, geography, community, and language. Dr. Glenn's primary interests are in how Indigenous peoples, refugees, captives, migrants, and other diasporic peoples in the Pacific and the Americas use language to construct, navigate, and politicize their identities. She commits her interests in systems, semiotics, and culture to an applied research method and curatorial practice that explore the rich vectors of change in community culture work programming. She's also the founder and executive director of the Popolo Project, a multimedia exploration of Blackness in Hawaii and the larger Pacific. She's also co-founder and principal at Hawaii Strategy Lab, a mixed method research project that brings together data, culture, and the service of social justice. Dr. Glenn was formerly the director of Tele, a language revitalization and engagement process in Hawaii's Tokulauan community, funded by Federal Administration for Native Americans here in Hawaii. So welcome, Dr. Glenn. And our second speaker today is Dr. Jonathan Okamura. And Dr. Okamura is a professor emeritus at the University of Hawaii, where he worked for more than 30 years, 20 of which were with the Department of Ethnic Studies. He is the author of several books, including Ethnicity and Inequality in Hawaii and Raced to Death in 1920s Hawaii, Injustice and Revenge in the Fukunaga Case. Professor Okamura continues to serve on the UH Manoa Commission on Racism and Bias and to write and lecture on race and ethnicity in Hawaii. Welcome, Dr. Okamura. And so to begin our time together this morning, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Okamura, who's going to get us started this morning. So Dr. Okamura, thank you for being with us, and the Zoom room is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Reverend Andrew. I hope you can see my slides now. Is that okay? No? I thought we had this worked out.
We can see you. We can hear you.
But can you see the slides?
Not yet.
Are you sharing your slides in the breakout room that you were in earlier for prep?
Yeah, same slides. Yeah, in the main room, yeah.
Okay.
Are you sharing screen?
Yeah, I clicked on share screen. Well, let me try this one. No.
Are you a co-host?
Yeah, I believe I was. I'm not. I thought we had worked on this earlier. How's that?
Yes. Excellent.
We can see that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Let me remove the side panel. Okay. Beginning then. So let me also thank the Diocese for inviting me, and particularly Reverend Arakawa, who made the initial invitation to me. And also mahalo to all of those who have zoomed in for my talk now. I titled my presentation, The Long, Hard Road to Reconciliation, because reviewing some examples, which I will do with you subsequently, it is a difficult process. Takes a lot of time, a lot of deliberation, a lot of commitment, a lot of willingness on the part of different parties to engage in this process and come to some agreement regarding reconciliation, which I will discuss in the second part of my presentation this morning. The first part will be, as I was asked to present, a history of race and racism, which is, of course, a very brief history, since this could take books to write about. And then the second part of my presentation, I will provide some examples going back to about a century ago of efforts at racial reconciliation in Hawaii on the part of different groups. So point one, prior to contact in 1778, there's no concept of race in Hawaii because race is based on the visibility of physical differences, most commonly skin color, but also hair color, hair texture, facial features, combination of what are called phenotypic characteristics of groups. But we can also emphasize that until 1887, when the Bayonet Constitution was imposed on King Kalakaua by resident Americans and Europeans, the kingdom was constitutionally colorblind. Race was not a source of invidious difference when it came to rights such as voting or running for office. Subsequently, with the Bayonet Constitution, race was used as the basis for making those kinds of distinctions among the population, which was multiracial. It was not just Native Hawaiians. There were, of course, whites from the continent and from Europe, and also a growing Chinese and Japanese population. Turning to racism, I'm providing here a minimal definition of racism, which will contrast with systemic racism. This minimal definition emphasizes a belief, perception, and attitude regarding the biological inferiority of a group of people considered a race in terms of their intelligence, sexuality, morality, personality, etc. Systemic racism differs substantially from this minimal definition of racism. This is a term I'm sure most of you have heard since the killing of George Floyd in May of 1920, because the media regularly used the term in its coverage of the George Floyd case. But it was a theory introduced by a race scholar named Joe Fagan way back in 2004. And what he emphasizes is that racism as a system consists of various components. First of which is discriminatory policies and practices. Also, material inequalities, socioeconomic ones based on occupation, income, education, wealth, etc. And then lastly, stereotypes, representations. This is the dimension closest to that minimal definition of racism I mentioned earlier. So it's very clear that until World War II, haoles ruled Hawaii through systemic racism, economically through the big five companies that dominated the economy, not just plantation agriculture, but wholesale retail trade, communication, transportation, and the small manufacturing sector. Politically, haoles also ruled Hawaii through the Republican Party, which they controlled, and by which they passed laws for their benefit or did not pass laws for the benefit of the majority non-haole population. So up until World War II, race is clearly the dominant principle of social organization in Hawaii. It established a social boundary by which haoles and non-haoles were separated, much to the disadvantage of non-haoles. This does not mean among non-haoles they did not recognize differences, but the boundary really mattered was between haoles and non-haoles that maintained the oppression of the non-haole groups, Hawaiians, Japanese, Chinese, etc. But after the war, we find very significant transformations occurring in Hawaii, initiated first by the ILWU, the International Longshore and Warehousemen's Union, regarding the economy, and also by the Democratic Party when it came to electoral politics. So the ILWU came to Hawaii in the mid-1930s out of San Francisco, a union of dock workers. It was successful in organizing dock workers in Hilo and Honolulu until the outbreak of the war. So after the war, they were able to recruit plantation workers who vastly outnumbered dock workers and called for a historic strike in 1946, that the first multi-racial strike in the history of Hawaii, involving some 24,000 plantation workers, lasted 79 days, and they were successful in winning a significant pay increase and changes in working and living conditions. So the ILWU called for about 4 other strikes among dock workers and sugar and pineapple workers through 1958. So at the time of statehood, 1959, the ILWU was the largest union, I believe, in the history of Hawaii, 75,000 members. The Democratic Party in 1954 gained control over the territorial legislature and has been in control subsequently since then. It worked closely at that time with the ILWU, which made financial contributions to the party and also endorsed pro-labor Democratic Party candidates. Once the party came to power, it initiated these reforms that provided for racial justice, racial equality, social justice, and economic reform. For example, increasing the minimum wage, expanding the University of Hawaii system through the community college, colleges on the neighbor islands, so those kids could have access to a college degree, and also increasing funding for the public schools. Most significantly, the party also established graduated tax schedule in Hawaii, as opposed to the flat tax rate of just 2%, which the Republicans had enforced previously, because the Republicans weren't interested in increasing tax revenues so that more government services, such as more schools, could be built for Hawaii's non-Haole population. As a result of these changes, point 7, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans were able to enter the middle class by the 1960s. So they attained this degree of socioeconomic mobility and therefore separated themselves from Native Hawaiians and Filipino Americans, groups with whom they had been aligned, collaborated with in the struggles of the ILWU and the Democratic Party previously. So those groups, and the Filipinos, still remain predominantly working class groups to this day. Point 8, by the 1970s, a quarter of a century after the war, in Hawaii, we have a transition from race to ethnicity as the leading organizing principle of our society. And this is what I'll pick up in the second lecture I'll be giving in the afternoon. Let me turn now to examples of racial reconciliation you can see in the history of Hawaii. Also keep in mind, when we speak of racial reconciliation, it goes beyond merely a settling of a dispute, a disagreement between parties. For racial reconciliation also involves coming to transforming the relations among different racial or ethnic groups and looking at examples of racial reconciliation from the 1990s, beginning most notably with South Africa. We can see these initiatives involving 2 primary dimensions. One is a formal apology being extended to the party, and secondly, reparations of some kind, material kind, provided to that aggrieved party. But both are not necessarily present on in these efforts. Point one, I think we can look upon the creation of the Hawaiian Homes Commission beginning in 1920 by Congress as an effort at reconciliation with Native Hawaiians. 200,000 acres of land, which is of course Native Hawaiian land stolen from them with the overthrow and the subsequent annexation of Hawaii, was made available to Native Hawaiians. But we also know that tens of thousands of Native Hawaiians are still waiting for their homestead lot. 1978, the voters of Hawaii approved the constitutional amendment that created the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, or OHA, which provides benefits and services only to Native Hawaiians in Hawaii. It also made Hawaiian an official language of the state besides English, but no apology, no material reparations were made at this time. In fact, I don't believe that OHA would be approved by the voters of Hawaii if this amendment came about at this time. Point three, this is an example of reconciliation with Japanese Americans when Congress provided $20,000 in what was called redress, but can be interpreted also as reparations to those Japanese Americans who had been interned, but who were still living. If your relative had died, eligible for any reparations. And they also received a formal apology from the first President Bush. Point four, the 100th anniversary of the overthrow of the monarchy was marked by an apology resolution passed by Congress, but introduced by Senator Daniel Akashi of Hawaii. This apology acknowledged the role of the US government in the overthrow of the monarchy, but no reparations were provided. I'm not even certain any significant consequences have resulted since that apology resolution was passed. In the same year, and this is an example, 5 and 6, for your diocese to consider beginning today in the breakout groups concerning reconciliation. But at that time, the president of the United Church of Christ, this is the successor to the Congregational Church that sent missionaries to Hawaii in 1820. The president extended this apology to Native Hawaiians for its role in the overthrow of the monarchy by the descendants of those New England missionaries, and also provided $1.2 million in reparations. Point six, the local United Church of Christ in Hawaii, led by what has been known as Asian American churches, largely Japanese American and Chinese American, over a period of 4 to 5 years of discussion, deliberation, opposition among themselves, also extended an apology to their 47 Native Hawaiian churches belonging to the United Church of Christ in Hawaii and their members, and to the larger Native Hawaiian community in Hawaii. They also notably provided reparations, $3.5 million in land, in cash, and 6 valuable parcels of land to these Native Hawaiian churches. Again, a possible example, model for your diocese to consider. Lastly, in 2020, a resolution was introduced at our state legislature by the Senate President and the House Speaker to, as you can see, convene a commission to formulate a reconciliation process between Native Hawaiians and the state of Hawaii, but it was not adopted. I believe because of very substantial opposition by Native Hawaiians to this resolution. We need to consider what was going on at that time? Well, of course, it was the ongoing opposition to constructing the TMT, the 30-meter telescope. And I believe people saw this as an effort to placate the Native Hawaiian community. If they would stop their opposition to the TMT, then the state would somehow step in and provide some forms of benefit services to the Native Hawaiian community. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Okamura, for your presentation for us this morning. And at this time, I'd like to hand over the Zoom room to Dr. Akiemi Glenn. Dr. Glenn, the Zoom room is yours.
Here we are. Now you can hear me. I just wanted to say that, like Dr. Okamura, I'm really grateful to be with you all this morning and commend you on this very important and difficult effort that your diocese is undertaking considering race here in Hawaii. Today, I'll keep my remarks relatively brief and hope that we'll have more time to delve into some of the more complex things that I bring up. But I'm hoping to orient us to a little bit more of a zoom out. Dr. Okamura really gave us a grounding in Hawaii and Hawaii's particular kind of historical and political moves around race. And I think it's important for us in understanding how Hawaii might take models from other parts of the world in doing this reconciliation work to understand how our particular formation of race is situated in the larger global phenomenon of race, including here in our region of the Pacific. So when we reckon with race today, we'll be not only recognizing and taking a hard look at, but also using it as a navigational tool to understand what the possibilities are for our community here in Hawaii. As was mentioned in my a little bit too long bio this morning, my ancestry and my homeland is an area that's now known as Virginia. My ancestors have lived there for many hundreds of years. I'm a descendant of indigenous people from this region, as well as indigenous people who were trafficked from Africa, places that I don't know. But my family is from this area. In particular, you might have thought about this area in the last couple of years because there's been some controversy around a historical project called the 1619 Project that starts and is focused on this area where my family is from. In this circled area here in yellow, on this map produced by the Virginia Company, which was a corporate entity that was traveling from England to the so-called New World to see what kinds of economic opportunities there were, especially in the exploitation of resources, natural resources there. They were very interested in cataloging everything that they could find and send back to Europe and introduce into the market. This is the origin of Virginia, the place that my family comes from. Here on this map, Point Comfort is the site where some of the first enslaved African people were brought and disembarked in 1619. Point Comfort was also known prior to the English arrival in what is now known as Virginia. It was known as Kekatan, which is one of my family's ancestral villages. And my maternal side of the family still uses that as our surname. We shorten it to Tan now. But as I situate myself and start to talk about what's going on in Hawaii, it's relevant that a place on the other side of the world, in fact, many places on the other side of the world, have something to say about how race has developed here in Hawaii and how race was imported here in that early contact period and has continued to develop over time. And I think crucially, we have to situate concepts of race in the economics. So as Dr. Okamura was mentioning, when we talk about the rise of union power here in Hawaii as a counter to racist and white supremacist ideas, there's no way for us to really reckon with the way that race has moved in the world without understanding the economic underpinnings of race. I'll also mention here, this is another area where my family comes from. We call it Osamokamuk. It's the growing place. My ancestral villages here are Nusiak and Croatan, and you may have heard of Croatan in the story of the Lost Colony. Again, an extension of that Virginia colony in the early 1500s. Who were very interested in cataloging and characterizing people and things and objects. So we have in the first action in the so-called New World, that eventually became the United States. And as the United States has arrived on our shores here in Hawaii, an idea about categorizing people, categorizing land, categorizing economic resources in an effort to be able to catalog what is available for various types of exploitation and profit. So you might be wondering why we started in Virginia and North Carolina, besides the fact that that's where my story begins. But it's important as we look at race in a place like Hawaii, where often we say, well, we don't have the same racial problems that exist in North America, and so we don't have any racial problems. That's something that we even heard in the last year as people were comparing the reality on the ground here in Hawaii with what was happening across North America. While it might look different, the underlying principles are still there. The economic principles, the idea of cataloging people based on the apparent diversity of humans, and then making that difference actually matter in a way that exempts some people from certain kinds of scrutiny and then subjects others to surveillance and control, and also marks others for expropriation of their land and resources, and expropriation of their labor and their right to self-determination. So while it might look a little bit different, the underlying principles remain, and that's crucial for us understanding not only the history, but the contemporary experience of race here in Hawaii. Of course, race comes into the way that we talk about our region, our Pacific region, broken up into concepts of Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia, larger Australanesia. This was something that was initiated by French analysts of explorers' notes in the 18th century primarily. And the first kind of inscription of Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, which was officially, essentially a racial categorization of the region, came from someone who had never visited this region and was reading notes and remarks from other people who had found their way here. But this idea, again, of the categorization as a way to make sense, very much rooted in Enlightenment values, that the world is knowable through discerning different categories and different valences, meanings, and values, was very prevalent. And of course, we still operate with those ideas today. Of course, we talk about the Polynesian Triangle, we talk about Micronesia and Micronesian people, even though we're talking about very heterogeneous groups of humans who live in one of the most diverse regions, human regions, geographical, geological regions on the planet. So I would point to this so that we're aware that we're still using some of these categories as if they were natural or apparent, when they were in fact very much constructed and also tied to this larger global project of economic exploitation and opportunism that has certainly come into our region. So many people are familiar with this particular representation of a map of the Atlantic world. As I said, I'm a product of this. My family, some of my ancestors were trafficked from places unknown to me now in West and Central Africa to the Americas, and lived under a forced labor regime for centuries. Some of my very first ancestors from Africa came to the United States, what's now the United States, in the 1500s and 1600s. Many of us are familiar with this because this is something that is taught in US schools, and we're aware of that particular human trafficking for economic gain. What many more of us are not aware of is how this particular institution pivoted to the Pacific after the American Civil War ended the kind of hold on sugar and cotton that Southern planters, Caribbean planters, and others had at the time. There was a pivot to the Pacific and to traffic people who came from, especially the Western Pacific, in so-called Melanesia, the Dark Islands. And this is a really important contextual linkage here because one, many of us don't know this story in the Pacific, but it is directly related to US and other imperial interests in the Pacific, including here in Hawaii. So these are folks who were trafficked from the Solomon Islands to sugar plantations in Australia. And this practice continued from the mid-1860s up until the early 20th century. And many of their descendants still live in Australia. Some of them have repatriated and returned home. But this same idea of racial slavery and the kidnapping and trafficking of people to maximize economic profit, and then using race and difference as a way to justify the expropriation of those people from their land, is crucial because it has been operating in our Pacific region for some time. few years ago, we shared a film at Bostock Theater about this very, historical moment. And many of the people in this audience, maybe some of you were in the audience with us that night, had never heard this story and had no idea of how American Civil War outcomes impacted the Pacific, but also led to people trying to see if there was viability for some of those monocrops here in Hawaii. Last summer, of course, even though people are not necessarily thinking of Blackness in the Pacific as related to Blackness in the Atlantic world, many people who've been racialized in our region did see themselves connected to the uprisings that were happening elsewhere. And in places like West Papua, we have seen over many decades, and certainly since the 1950s and 60s, decolonization efforts in the Pacific, linking to decolonization efforts in the Caribbean and Africa as well. And just as a note, as we're thinking about what's different and what's the same about Hawaii, there is a history of economic monocropping, agricultural exploitation of these lands, of this Aina. And this is an image from the 1840s, from my colleague Guy Emerson Mount, who's a historian of this period. And there were lots of different agricultural schemes that were tested out here in Hawaii, even during the kingdom period. So this is cotton. This is a cotton plantation that was tested out in Kunia here on the island of Oahu. And at the time, there were business and cultural interests that skewed towards white supremacy that were very interested in seeing how Hawaii would be a new frontier to spread plantation, not only economy, but plantation culture. And so in this period, there were consultants coming from places like South Carolina and Georgia during the time that enslavement was active there, who were advising landowners and some of the Haole elite class here was interested in developing a similarly profitable monocropping agricultural paradigm here in Hawaii. And I would argue there's a lot of evidence that those folks being here and thinking of these economic opportunities laid the seeds for the overthrow. And I think it's important that we understand that the overthrow did not happen on its own. It was not just some individual businessmen who saw an opportunity, but this was rather embedded in a global movement of white supremacy for economic supremacy as well. So there's a straight line here from those kinds of economic opportunities and interests and the coup against the government in 1893. And if we think about what was happening in the 1890s in the United States, this is the fever pitch of racial violence and terror across the United States, including in North Carolina, where my family is from. We saw democratically elected governments overturned by white supremacist economic interests. And that's important, especially when we think about how the United States reckoned with the overthrow. And there were multiple congressional delegations that came to Hawaii to determine whether or not this was a legitimate political move. And of course, many of you may know the Blunt Report that happened in 1893, which said essentially this is an illegitimate move on the part of the United States, followed up in 1894 by the Morgan Report, which was led by John Tyler Morgan, a US Senator from Alabama, who was also very active and proudly, publicly, a part of the Ku Klux Klan. And so when you read the Morgan Report, you see in no uncertain terms that he was thinking about the racial reality of Hawaii through an American lens, and saying that just like in post-Reconstruction South, it's illegitimate and inappropriate for people of color, in particular Hawaiians who were racialized in ways that were very similar to Black people at the time, to be running their own government and in control of their lands and resources. So you see this in examples like this racialization of the Queen that appeared. These are quite grotesque images. I apologize for that so early in the morning. But you see this racialization of the Queen that draws on tropes specifically around Black women. So she's depicted here as very dark skinned with a certain texture of hair. And I think very interestingly with giant gold hoop earrings, which are not traditionally part of Polynesian or Hawaiian dress, but they are part of our indigenous African practices. And women in particular across our diaspora have worn big gold hoop earrings. So they were making this comparison very directly. Of course, following up in the 1920s, which is an era that Dr. Okamura has written about, and is a really crucial time for understanding the ways that race became really entrenched here. There were advertisements. There was a concerted effort in this early territorial period to replace not only the Native Hawaiian population, but to counter the growing Japanese population here. And so there was a time that it was politically expedient to kind of lean into some of these conversations that were also happening in North America to counter the Japanese presence there. So this is an actual ad asking for white people to move to Hawaii in the 1920s. And it advertises that there's an income tax levied here that will supplement the travel and moving costs for white people who come, so that the demographics of Hawaii will change. Of course, there are really important moments in this history. The Fukunaga case, which I won't spend too much time talking about, but I encourage you to check out Dr. Okamura's work on this. Of course, many of us also know the Massey case and the racialization that was happening at the time, especially drawing into anti-Black tropes and ideas of the sanctity and purity of white womanhood that resulted in the murder of Joseph Kahahawai. And certainly as we think about all of this, though our community of people of African descent here in Hawaii is quite small, all of these ideas, the racialization of the queen, those tropes that were enacted against people like Joseph Kahahawai, are rooted in anti-Blackness and the idea that even if Black people aren't here, there is a reference in a white supremacist imperial framework for our degradation. And so we see this come forward in recent years with the killing of Starsky Willie, a young Micronesian boy, a Chuukese boy in Kalihi, who was killed by his neighbor right around the same age, and in a very similar fashion to Trayvon Martin, whose death sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. And of course, we've seen that in the rhetoric around the deaths of these two men at the hands of our Honolulu Police Department just earlier this year. And so the question really is, what is different about Hawaii? If we can situate Hawaii in this larger global context of race, when people are not really sure if we can talk about Hawaii in terms of Black and white, I would submit that we can't. We have to have a much more dynamic conversation about what is actually going on here and who's doing it and why and what the benefits are. A couple of years ago, there was a New York Times article, maybe some of you read it, asking if you want to be less racist, you should move to Hawaii because we apparently have no problems of race. And of course, I know Dr. Okamura was quoted in this piece, and I was as well. It was certainly not what I was expecting it to be, because I think as the presentation has shown so far, there's a lot that we have to reckon with here. And I think that there are lots of conversations for us to have in addition to the financial, to think about what it means to belong here, what it means to be seen and recognized as part of this community, and being able to give a contribution to this community, what it means to actually reckon with our colonial history and the history of the dispossession of Hawaii from its government and its people. And thinking about the ways that we have an opportunity in pursuing reconciliation to revise some of the erasures that have been enacted. This is Dole Street, which someone just recently changed back to its original name, Kapa'akea. This is near the University of Hawaii. So there are questions for us to think about what it would take and what it would mean for us to really be honest about what has happened here and the kinds of erasures that have created difficult situations for us, yes, existentially and philosophically, but also crucially economically and in terms of safety, in terms of the actual ability to live our lives safely and to be meaningfully a part of a community. So we see this in the housing crisis. This is a meme that was circulating a while ago. We're experiencing one of the starkest scenarios of wealth inequality anywhere else in the world. Certainly here under the jurisdiction of the United States, Hawaii has overwhelming wealth inequality. We see that in the housing market. And we also see it in situations where Native Hawaiians have been removed from stewardship. This is on Mauna Kea in 2019. And there's a real opportunity for us as people who are thinking about justice and who are thinking about truth to reckon with these things. And I hope that the conversation today, especially as we get into our breakout sessions and get to talk and learn more from each other, will start to point us into some directions that allow us to move forward, being on the same page and aware of this place and this particular inheritance that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of our presenters, Dr. Okamura and Dr. Glenn. What amazing things you've given us to think about and to talk about. We're going to have a small break. I'm going to keep everyone in this main room, and then at about 10:26 or so, 5 or 6 minutes, I'll put you into breakout rooms, and those breakout rooms will start at 10:30. So feel free to get up, get a glass of water, a cup of coffee if you're still waking up, go to the bathroom, whatever you need to do, and at 10:30 we will be in our breakout rooms. Thank you. I'm just going to give everyone a minute to time and space travel back into our main room after your breakout groups. I hope that those were open-hearted, fruitful discussions. I hope too that you have sort of a brown bag lunch, or that you're going to carry your computer around with you, so that we can enjoy the offerings given to us next by our two musicians. I'm going to give you their bios. Sharing music and space with us this early afternoon, I suppose, mid-morning. We have Dr. Jonathan K. Kamakaviva Ole Osorio, who is Dean of Hawai'i Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge. Dr. Osorio received his PhD in history from the University of Hawaii. At Kamaka Ku'okalani, he has developed and taught classes in history, literature, law as culture, music as historical texts, and research methodologies for and from Indigenous peoples. His recent publications include The Value of Hawaii, Knowing the Past and Shaping the Future, which he co-edited and authored, and Dismembering Lahui, A History of the Hawaiian Nation to 1887. He is also a composer and singer and has been a Hawaiian music recording artist since 1975. With him, we have his daughter, Dr. Jamaica Heoli Mele Kalani Osorio, who is a Kanaka Maoli Wahine artist, activist, scholar, storyteller, born and raised in Palolo Valley to parents Jonathan and Mary Osorio. Heoli earned her PhD in English, Hawaiian literature in 2018 from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Currently, Heoli is an assistant professor of Indigenous and Native Hawaiian politics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Heoli is a 3-time national poetry champion, poetry mentor, and a published author. In 2020, her poetry and activism were the subject of an award-winning film, This Is the Way We Rise, which is an awesome film, directed by Clara Lacey, which was featured in Vogue.com and at Sundance Film Festival. She is a proud past Kaiapuni student, Ford Fellow, and a graduate of Kamehameha, Stanford University, BA, and New York University for her MA. Her book, Remembering Our Intimacies, Mo'olelo, Aloha Aina, and Ea, was published in 2021 by the University of Minnesota Press. We are so grateful to both of you for sharing space with us as we have our lunch. And those of you who are on camera, you're welcome to stay on camera or to turn your camera off while you eat and enjoy the sharing from these two amazing people. Mahalo to John and Heoli.
Aloha mai kākou, o wau o Kamakaviva Ole Osorio. Makemake au e ho'olauna I ka'u kaikamahine o Jamaica Heoli Mele Kalani Osorio. And we are here today to meet with you and to present a series of stories and mele. I believe along the
There you go.
of reconciliation.
Answer.
And we will probably have people chiming in from time to time. Don't worry about that.
Answer.
It's not us. Yeah. So before we begin on this, and I'm actually going to begin with a mele that was also a prayer that I helped compose back in 1993. Before we begin with this talk, I just want to say something about the issue of reconciliation, forgiveness, and audience. Because when we think about words like reconciliation, we really are speaking of an exchange, the idea of a relationship. And I'm very conscious of the fact that I am speaking to people that I have a good deal in common with. I was raised in a Christian tradition in a UCC church, Hawai'i church in Hawaii. My mother, my grandmother were both leaders in that church and kept all of us in that family, all of my siblings, to this day. We are believers in that message through practice and training, and of course through the relationships we had with our own parents. I have that connection with a great many of you that we are speaking to today. But in some ways, my daughter Haoli is also an audience to some of the things that I'm saying, because we didn't raise her that way. I think we tried, but this was the 1990s and 2000s, and we had many other things on our mind, including trying to resurrect our own national identity and our own struggle for justice in the Hawaiian Islands. Those issues and the values associated with them were much more important to the raising of our children. And I'm speaking for both myself and for my wife. We were church attendees. We were members of a Lutheran faith. We clearly, enjoyed the services and went and supported the church. As for our children, we let them make their own decisions. And the result is that to this day, in our household, Jamaica and I have a contested relationship over the issue of Jesus and the gospel and forgiveness. And that's as it should be. It is, in fact, one of the things that lends a kind of not just complexity, but a richness to some of the things that I'm going to be saying today, and the way that we come to you. You are not the only audience. She is in many ways an audience, as I have been an audience to the things that she believes and the values that she has come to embrace. The struggle between us is not ideological. It is not even theological. It is ethical. It is moral. And I believe that if I carried anything from my early training in the Church of Jesus Christ, it is that this is what defines us as a people, to struggle constantly with ethics and morality as we look at the world. So, I'm going to turn this now to a more focused conversation, and we're going to use as really the focal point of this conversation, the Queen, Liliuokalani. We're going to open with some mele that are connected with the Queen and with the struggle of Kanaka Maoli to reconnect with her example in 1993, in 1994, in 95, and really all the way to the end of her life. The example that she gave us, not just as a political leader, not just as an ancestor, but as a Christian. And I'm going to then take the time to read to you a speech that I wrote and delivered to the Episcopal Church at St. Andrews in Honolulu in January of 2004. I'm going to guess that not many of you were there. It was an awfully long time ago. And I'm going to read that sermon again. It's a sermon on reconciliation. And then we're going to come back and talk about the Queen and the example she leaves for us to this day, and how we behave in this world, how we as Kanaka behave in Hawaii, what our aims and aspirations are, and what we expect from those who are not Kanaka and who are nevertheless really interested in a true and sincere effort at reconciliation. So, this is a mele that I wrote with Kanalu Young, who was actually an Episcopalian when he wrote this. He was a member of the church at St. Mark's on Kapahulu Avenue, along with John Keola Lake. No, wait, I'm sorry. John Keola Lake did not write this song, so it's just me and Kanalu. And we wrote this for the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the loss of our national government, when the Queen's government was taken by force and intimidation by a small, very, very small group of mostly Americans and European men who declared that she was not the legitimate government, and they were
missionary descendants.
And they were, yeah, very many of them were missionary descendants. So it's not like she's not going to talk.
It's critical
right?
to the story.
She will actually come in.
It's also critical to the resistance to that overthrow is Hawaiian Christians calling out
That's correct.
the contradiction of these descendants of missionaries not acting as Christians in their theft of the kingdom. Just good. I'm just letting him know.
Yeah.
The historian know. He might have forgotten.
I have not forgotten. I'm conscious of time.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So, yes, the members of the Committee of Safety were predominantly the grandchildren of American missionaries who came here in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s to rescue Hawaiians. There'll be more on that, especially in the talk I'm going to be giving in a few minutes. We commemorated that loss on January 17th, 1993, with a huge gathering at the palace and a declaration by tens of thousands of Kanaka Maoli to recover our national government and our sovereignty. And this is a struggle and an endeavor in which we are still very much engaged. This song is called Pule no Ke'ea, a prayer for sovereignty, a prayer for life, a prayer for dignity, a prayer for the spirit that comes in the breath, the breaths that we take, and in the fact that everything breathes, the air that we share. So thank you. We're just imagining everyone clapping out there, and we appreciate that. I'm going to say a few words about this mo'olelo that really enshrines this next song that we're going to perform. The Queen's government, and that is actually the monarchy, had existed by the declaration of a constitution back in 1840. The constitutional monarchy of the Hawaiian Kingdom was recognized by the British and the French, and later by the Americans in 1843. Following that, between the 1840s and the 1880s, the kingdom engaged, like any other nation state in the world at that time, in commerce and trade, in the building up of industry in Hawaii, primarily sugar. It had economic and political treaties with over 84 governments in the world, and especially with the United States, and it had several long-term kinds of treaties with the United States. Those treaties were broken, and the relationship between Hawaii and the United States, when the Americans landed troops on January 15th, 1893, to defend this small group of imposters who were attempting to take power over the Queen. They landed especially at a company of American Marines and Blue Jackets who took up a line between the Queen's government at the palace and the insurrectionists, and essentially required that in order for her to arrest the insurrectionists, as she certainly had the right to do, she would have had to have attacked or killed American troops. The Queen, and this will be part of the story later on, the Queen declined to do this and instead surrendered her government and herself, her body, to the U.S. The U.S., however, did not take this responsibility, and instead she was turned over to the insurrectionists to do with whatever they wished with her. Over the course of the next 2 years, the insurrectionists took pains to cement a relationship with the United States that would allow them basically to do whatever they wished, primarily to pursue their economic gains without interference from the government and from the Queen's government. In January of 1895, a group of Hawaiian patriots, and I think it's important to use that word because they intended to take back the Queen's government by force. The effort went poorly. Hundreds of them were arrested, and the Queen was arrested for, the charge was misprision of treason. The pretend government calling themselves the Republic of Hawaii, which was basically these same guys and a few thousand other Europeans, they charged her with misprision of treason and confined her to the palace for an undisclosed kind of future. There was talk of 10 years at hard labor, there was talk of execution, but essentially they had her helpless. She was confined in to a bedroom on the second floor, on the upper floor of the palace from which she had once reigned, and not allowed visitors except for one personal visit, carefully monitored by the Republic police officers, so that she would be cut off from her people. While she was incarcerated, her people were writing hundreds of songs and poems and essays, many of which were published in Hawaiian language newspapers, proclaiming their loyalty to the Queen. At that point, there were close to 38,000 Kanaka Maoli, subjects of the Queen. Almost all of them were very opposed to the takeover by the Republic, and increasingly were opposed to annexation by the United States. They wrote these songs for her. They wrote the songs for the men who had led the insurrection, the attempt to restore her government in 1895. They wrote songs commending their bravery and their loyalty and their fidelity to the only government they had ever known. And the Republic attempted to keep her from knowing any of this. And so I wonder if you could maybe just take over while I tune here and tell the rest of the story.
Sure. So one of the ways that they isolated the queen, right, in addition to physically isolating her in her own palace and imprisoning her in her palace, they weren't allowing any letters or any correspondence in or out of her room. And so her personal attendant, the one wahine who was able to visit her once a day, of course, came with flowers, with pua. Many of the times these flowers were gathered from Lili'u's own garden at Uluhai Malama, which is what now the site of the Holiday Inn Hotel. I don't know what the name of the hotel is now, but in the 1970s it was the site of the Holiday Inn Hotel. But wrapped around these flowers would be newspapers, right? Because you had to wrap the flowers in something. And so her attendants were able to bring her messages from the outside, messages of aloha, of commitment to the queen and commitment to the kingdom and commitment to the lahui. And at the same time as these songs were flooding in, these messages of aloha were flooding in, Lili'u composed some of her most powerful and to this day famous famous songs that we know of, and one of them we'll sing right now. During this time, she talks about in her book, if you want to learn more about Lili'u and kind of this particular mo'olelo, she has a book entitled Hawai'i Story by Hawai'i's Queen. She talks about the charges against herself. She talks about the attempts to restore the government, but she also talks about what it was like to compose while imprisoned in her own palace. And she says to compose was as natural to her as it was to breathe. And to breathe, ea, is one of the words we use for sovereignty, for self-determination, and for life and breath. So there's a sense of urgency. There is a sense of commitment to that larger struggle for ea, for sovereignty, in the way that Lili'u is composing these mele and reconnecting back to her lahui through these songs. So. No.
No. Oi.
I over. Yeah. A gentle breeze, a waft my name. Oh, hali ali amayana, ia
gentle breeze that waft my name. It come to me,
It is such an amazing song because it reaches down across the century to us as a measure of the Queen's great aloha for the people that she led. And to really understand her as a person would take more time than we have for today. Just to say that as a Hawaiian chiefess, as an ali'i nui, as a high chiefess, growing up in a family that was trained by birth and by birthright to rule, she understood a connection and a responsibility for her people that is really unusual and difficult sometimes for us in the society we live in to actually see. So I'm going to read this sermon. It was a sermon that I gave in 2004 at St. Andrews. And I read through it again today and I didn't see anything I have come to disagree with over the years. So let's just see how it goes.
How convenient.
Yeah. Yes, you get older, you get more. A few years ago, I spoke before an audience at the Museum of America in Washington, D.C. about Lili'u Okalani and Grover Cleveland. Though it was primarily an American audience that had come to hear a discussion of Cleveland's qualities as a president, his humanity and sense of fairness, I used the occasion as an opportunity to extol the Queen. I pointed out that in the end, Cleveland could not ignore the overwhelming political influences that prevented him from acting justly, whereas the Queen refused to do evil despite the political consequences. I spoke to that audience about why we honor and in fact revere this woman, while Grover Cleveland remains largely overlooked, if not forgotten by his own people. And I think I do need to say that Grover Cleveland was the president in 1894. The Queen appealed to him to restore her monarchy. He believed that she was completely correct. He asked Congress to act. Congress, which was run by Republicans at the time, refused to act, and he stepped down. To return to the speech. But the fact is that Lili'u's behavior and her principles confound me. not because I cannot understand her sacrifice or the reasoning behind her actions, but because the pure selflessness of her surrender resonates on the very edge of naivete. She and the nation were not prepared to go to war to defend our existence at the end of the 19th century, when even those tribes and countries willing to kill and die were all swept up by the Belgians and the Dutch, French, British, Germans, and finally American colonial enterprises. At least they fought. One cannot tell the story of the overthrow to Americans and Europeans without at least one person voicing what perhaps many people think, that freedom and sovereignty, a people's way of life, and perhaps any virtue, from decency to mercy, can only thrive when good people are willing to fight and die to protect them. It is, I think, this belief that violence done in the name of God or goodness is necessary and desirable that will continue to bring the Church of Jesus Christ seeking reconciliation. For when we turn to the Bible for an answer on the relationship between justice and violence, we get somewhat conflicting messages. To establish the Hebrews in Canaan, God inspired the invasion and destruction of cities, the killing of its inhabitants, and even the founding of a society that vigorously excluded non-Hebrews. The gospel, however, is ever more unmistakable that we are to forgive our enemies, love our neighbors, and open our religion and ourselves to the world. As human beings, we comprehend the Old Testament better, I think. That's why I say that Lili'u's example confounds me. We see ourselves more realistically, don't we, in the examples of warriors than we do in the examples of Christ. We understand fighting and killing, and can more readily accommodate our Christian ideals with the necessity of invading another country, killing or intimidating its citizens, and imposing our will on them in order to protect our way of life, in order to make ourselves more secure. Then we can accommodate our fears and insecurities with a gospel that simply calls on us to love. I used to think that a major disconnection existed between the Old and New Testament, and it's only been over the past few years, and only because of the examples of people like Lili'u Okalani, that I have managed to reconcile these texts and the spiritual guides they provide. The Queen chose not to kill. It was clearly a rational decision, given the military power of the United States. But that choice was also framed in the finest traditions of the gospel that she believed. These are her words. In order to avoid the loss of life that our people can ill afford, she preferred to subject herself to certain humiliation and an otherwise indefinite fate. And while I used to think that she placed her faith in the ultimate goodness of the United States, I certainly do not believe that today. She knew Americans, and she'd had enough experience to understand how powerful people behave. No, I think she placed her faith in God. And not necessarily to restore her throne, but to give her the strength to deal with the unknown trials ahead. When I look at my own people and how we have responded, not just to the loss of our government, but to every other loss of language, history, connection to the Aina, to our land, and even our reputation as a people, I marvel that we have responded with such grace and dignity. And I know that she bears much of the credit for that. It is not easy for the political historian and nationalist that I am to stand before an audience and speak of grace. We know so much more now about the role of the American church in Hawaii, its antecedents, its intentions, and its complicity in the loss of our country. Moreover, the Christian-reared voice in me rails against the hypocrisy of the mission that came to help the people and helped itself to so much. But that is the way of the world. We can recognize that when missionaries came, only a few were able to resist the temptation of taking care of themselves. Most were just human beings, and they chose to live well in the world. There are justifications for that, and they are numerous, and they are documented, speak for themselves in history, and so they are remembered. And if we believe that they set out from Boston and Connecticut with the best of intentions, then we must simply acknowledge that life provided other choices for them, and they made, for good and evil, the choices they made. God forgives us all. And so we must forgive those who trespass against us. But as we too live in the world, we are entitled to ask whether forgiveness is all there is to the message of grace. If that is so, then why should we not rise up against the wealthy and land it here and threaten their secure and comfortable existences, justifying it in the name of retribution and justice? Why should we not consider ho'omanavanui, patience, an evil and exploitive word that simply consigns our people to another generation of want? If our faith promises forgivenesses for their excesses, will God not also forgive us ours? There's simply no answer to this, for me at least, but the gospel. The stories of the Old Testament tell us only that one must convey one's ethics to the realities of human frailty. Be as good as you can be. Obey the laws. Do what you can when you can. But the gospel of Jesus calls on us to be better. And this, in her time of trial, is what the Queen chose. And the gospel resonates among our people at all. And if the gospel resonates among our people at all in this century, it is because of what she did 111 years ago. I do not believe that the gospel resonates because of the glorious history of the church. We are too wise, too well informed for that. We know that there is a direct connection between Christianity and violence. It was the violence done against our Savior and against the early converts of the Roman Empire that founded the church, but it was also violence that our church perpetrated that marked its growth through crusades, inquisitions, witch burning, and the conquest of the Americas and the Pacific. We, the inheritors of the gospel, cannot be permitted to forget that history. So I end by calling on the Church of Jesus Christ to pursue, but with Jesus Christ. For while individuals who call themselves Christians behave so badly, it was the silence of the church then that requires reconciliation today. No one expects the church to be perfect, but it should strive to be at least as good as its greatest examples. It should strive to follow the examples of Li'u. It certainly has its opportunity. Where the United States has invaded other lands, uttering justifications that we Hawaiians have heard before, the church should not remain silent. When any nation suspends the civil rights of its people, subjecting citizens and non-citizens to an uncertain judicial procedure, in violation of what international bodies have come to see as basic human rights, the church should not remain silent. The church should be loud and aggressive in the protection of political prisoners, but also of criminals. It should certainly risk the political incorrectness of protesting the mistreatment of women in other cultures, though not also without erasing inequities within our own churches and societies over ordaining women and members of the LGBTQ community. We should be outraged at the very presence of hunger in the world, when there is so much wealth in this nation. Wherever people are oppressed, no matter who their oppressors, the church should be there to protest, to comfort, and to protect. the church should never content itself with being a place where its members may come to feel smug and satisfied that they are forgiven and saved. It is far too difficult to follow Christ's example. We should always acknowledge that love never fails, that only through love can we prevent ourselves from condemning the soldiers and warriors who kill, while still insisting on protecting and comforting their victims. We should not be silent. We should be like Jeremiah and Hosea, Nathan, Elijah, calling our political leaders to task at every hypocrisy, at every deceit, and certainly at every misuse of wealth and power. We should be a royal pain in the ass. Liliuokalani could do little more than offer her people a way to live with the indignities and uncertainties of the future. Does Christ provide any less assuring an example to us than the Queen? If we would be Christians as Christ intended, then we would be like Liliu, not perfect, but reconciled to the outcomes of our choices, realistic about the world and its violences, but unwilling to justify them, unwilling, no matter the provocation, to do evil.
Got a couple of minutes. What are we gonna do?
We only have a couple of minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
You got 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
Yep.
We're going to finish with Mauna Kea.
Okay.
I really wish I could ask Keoli to maybe lead us into this song. Just tell us why we are doing this for you. You don't have to connect it to anything I just said.
What are you tuning to E? I think let's just do Colonialism.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
All right.
So we're going to change things up and do a different song that was written for the Queen at the time of the overthrow, when the provisional government had required all public employees to sign records of allegiance to this new fake, we called them the PG, the Piki, the Kolea, the birds that migrate here to become fattened off of our wonderful bounty and then leave without contributing anything in return. So the song was written by the request of the Royal Hawaiian Band, because they refused to sign such letters of allegiance. And in their refusal, they said they rather eat rocks than sign over their allegiance to the Queen, to this new fake government. I think it fits. Sorry, we're gonna go a little over time. We'll sing fast. I think it fits with the message that my father has offered. If we look at the movements that propped up in the wake of the overthrow in the late 1800s, so much of the organizing of our people took place in the church, because these are the places that they had gathered. These are the places where these are the people that they had gathered with week after week. So many of the folks who were organizing against this provisional fake government, who were organizing against the eventual fake annexation, they were doing this in their church. And if the pastors didn't get on board, they expelled the pastors and they took over those spaces. So the idea that, not only should the church not remain silent, the important part of this message to me is that it is the people, right? It is the lahui, the congregation, that will make that so. And we cannot expect leadership, those at the top, to make those decisions. It will always be from the power of the people to create that change.
Mai Hawai'i moku o te ave Koku ana honoa o Bi'inoni kawaii o mano Kapu me ke ui o kapu i hera
Ao ea e kau I ka punima.
We will not fix our signature to the paper of the enemy. Sail. Annexation. And it's lost. Our civil rights. Ole mako. Ole mako a e mina mina. We don't value the government's money. Kala o ke au puni. Ualava mako I ka poha. We are satisfied with the stones, the food of our land. Mahope mako I unani. Aloha ai ka pono kaina. Kaina ia mai ana ka puana. O ka pohe I aloha I kaina.
Mahalo, folks. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Doctors Heoli and John Osorio. It was absolutely moving, your music and the mo'olelo you shared with all of us, and very inspiring for us as a church, challenging us and putting us in a place where we need to wrestle and stretch and move forward on all that's been shared today. So thank you so much. Just so appreciate both of your time, energy, and just your presence. It was just so delightful to have you and to, in a way, get invited into your home, and which was wonderful. So thank you so much.
Mahalo. Sorry we went over time, but thank you for
No,
having
this was wonderful and perfect. Absolutely perfect.
Take care.
Ahui ho.
Thank you. Thank you. Ahui ho. Dear friends, thank you again for staying with us for the brown bag lunch time with the Osorios. I was truly moved by what they shared, and I hope all of you were able to experience some of that as well. I saw the chat box kind of light up with people's comments, and it was just wonderful to see. And so, welcome back from lunch. What a full lunch. I hope everybody had some time to nourish themselves, not only with food, and again, with the nourishing music and stories that were shared with us as well. So as we move forward into the day, I just want to say that we're going to move into our second plenary session, and then have a break at around 12:55 before we have our second breakout session in the afternoon. So again, I would like to invite back Drs. Okamura and Dr. Glenn, and we're going to invite Dr. Okamura first, again, to take the Zoom room for us and present us with his second session for us this afternoon. So Dr. Okamura, the Zoom room is yours.
Okay, thank you, Reverend Andrew. It worked, right? You can see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Great. All right. So we'll go to the second part of my presentation today, focused on the contemporary situation regarding ethnicity and ethnic relations. And this first part, I'll focus on the myth about Hawaii and its ethnic relations, which can be interpreted as resistance to reconciliation. And then I'll talk about the reality of persisting racism, inequality, which provides to me, and I'm sure many others, the rationale for reconciliation. So let's start with this myth. Going back 100 years, already there was this racial glorification of Hawaii in the 1920s, as advanced by the Advertiser and at least one sociologist at the University of Hawaii, Romanzo Adams, who wrote about Hawaii as a racial melting pot. And Adams and other observers of Hawaii since then have focused on the high intermarriage rate in Hawaii. Also, the absence of any laws banning interracial marriage, in contrast to the continent, where eventually, I think, 38 states prohibited interracial marriage until the 1967 Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court.
So then how is the ordering handled nowadays?
Sorry? I heard somebody make a comment. But in the 1920s, Dr. Glenn mentioned the Fukunaga case. So at that time, the Advertiser argued that the Japanese American community, by filing these legal challenges to Fukunaga's conviction and death sentence, was disrupting of the racial harmony that otherwise existed in Hawaii, which was, obviously an absurd argument. But over time, what has happened is that this idea of Hawaii as a racial paradise became transformed into the idea of as a multicultural model, that Hawaii could serve as an example to other racially and ethnically divided societies, how to solve your problems dealing with racism and ethnic and racial conflict. So according to this model, Hawaii is a place of tolerance, harmony, equality in its relations among various groups. And we do a better job of getting along with one another than on the US continent. But of course, if you compare ourselves to places like Los Angeles, this isn't difficult to come to that kind of conclusion. So Obama, for example, in 2008, when he was first campaigning for the presidency, at least in Hawaii, he talked about Hawaii as a multicultural model. And he talked about growing up with the Aloha spirit. He did not discuss these issues when he was running for the presidency on the continent, but at least in Hawaii. Numerous examples have followed in recent years, at least 2 public forums, both with the same title, What Can Hawaii Teach America About Race? Again, the idea, we've solved our problems. Racial conflict is not an issue here. We solve the problems to the extent we can teach a much more vastly complex and diverse America about race, even though we don't talk about race in Hawaii. We talk about ethnic groups or ethnicity, but less so race. What accounts for these forums? Well, you recall the Black Lives Matter movement had emerged just very recently, and this was the response organized by different groups here in Hawaii. Dr. Glenn mentioned that New York Times essay, Want to Be Less Racist, Move to Hawaii. It was based on a study done by UH Manoa social psychologists who did a study with first-time freshmen from the continent, white students who came to Manoa, sampled them in September after they had arrived, 9 months later, right before they left, and argued that there was a significant decrease in their expressions of racist attitudes. What was not mentioned in that New York Times essay, though, is the researchers who did this study also sampled local students, largely non-white, non-Hawai'i, from Hawaii, over that same 9-month period and found an increase in their racist attitudes, which the scholars, researchers attributed to their increased interactions with white students. They also, I would argue, probably had increased interactions with white faculty. So I wrote facetiously about this study that it could have been titled, "Want to be less racist? Don't attend UH Manoa." But the problem with this multicultural model is that it maintains things as they are, particularly the status quo of racism, inequality, subordination in Hawaii. These are not viewed as problems that require immediate attention, and therefore they persist over time. So the reality in Hawaii is persisting ethnic inequality and persisting systemic racism. Hawaii is a very unequal society. People may not necessarily believe in this, recognize it, but I would argue since especially the 1970s, after tourism became the mainstay of our economy following statehood, there has been relatively little collective socioeconomic mobility. Group mobility, as evident from the advancement of Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans into the middle class by the 1960s. So let's be clear in terms of this inequality that exists. The dominant groups are whites, Japanese Americans, and Chinese Americans, both in political and economic terms. We can't continue to blame whites or haules for all the problems that we have experienced. The subordinate groups are Native Hawaiians, Filipinos, Samoans, and some other smaller groups, Pacific Islander, such as Tongan or Micronesians, or Asian groups such as Vietnamese. Now, I don't necessarily have the data to prove this, that the gap has been widening, but I do know that gap is not closing because we do not see collective socioeconomic mobility from those subordinate groups. We do see evidence of individuals becoming part of a middle class, graduating with college degrees and holding professional jobs, but the numbers involved are not such that we can talk about collective mobility on the part of those subordinate groups. And there are two primary reasons I would argue for this continuing persistence of ethnic inequality. One is our overdependence on tourism as the major industry. And the other is, as I said, persisting systemic racism. Tourism provides largely low wage, low mobility, low security jobs. Especially made evident during the pandemic when we had thousands of hotel industry, tourist industry workers rather, laid off. These are not the types of jobs, service and sales largely, that can provide avenues for collective mobility. The other issue with tourism is it is the main source of tax revenues in Hawaii. So if the industry is doing especially well, as it was doing through 2019, we have an abundance of tax revenues, $1 billion that the legislature had in terms of a surplus, but that quickly disappeared the following year as a result of the pandemic. So I'll come back to this issue concerning tax revenues subsequently. The other factor, as I mentioned, for the persistence of ethnic inequality is continuing systemic racism. So to remind you, the different dimensions of systemic racism include institutional discrimination, not individual acts, discrimination through policies and practices, socioeconomic inequalities in employment and education, and racist stereotypes and narratives. And all of these are evident in the contemporary situation in the experience of different groups. So let's start with discriminatory practices. I would say one of the worst of these when it comes to contributing to inequality is the underfunding of our K-12 public schools. This is a practice engaged in by the legislature since at least the 1990s, if not earlier, not to provide the public schools with the funds necessary for the schools to provide even an adequate education to our public school students. And how do we know this? Because for years, the schools have opened with a shortage of teachers, as many as 1,000 teachers, even after the DOE has recruited teachers from the continent to come to Hawaii, or has hired emergency hire staff. I call them staff because they're not teachers. They have a bachelor's degree, but they do not have the professional certification, which other public school teachers have, that indicate that they are qualified teachers. 70% of the public school students belong to subordinate minorities. The other 30% are whites, Japanese American, Chinese American, the dominant groups. These are also the groups that constitute the largest, if not the majority, of private school students in Hawaii. Parents with the financial means, being fully aware of the problems with the public schools, the underfunding, will do what they can to provide a private school education for their children. This is the reason why we have the highest percentage at 16% of private school enrollment in Hawaii. Now, one might say, well, why is this discrimination? If you have the ability to pay, you could go to private school, or the schools are public, they admit anyone. I would argue it's discrimination because of the differential impact underfunding has on the people of Hawaii. Those that are most disadvantaged belong to those subordinate minorities. Point 6, Micronesians, or they can also be called COFA citizens, compacts of free association signed between their home nations and the US government in the 1980s and the 1990s. Clearly, the most racially oppressed, the most racially denigrated group in Hawaii. When it comes to institutional discrimination, they were the target of racial profiling by the Honolulu Police Department, the group that was vastly overrepresented for arrests for violating the stay-at-home orders that emerged at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. In terms of socioeconomic inequalities, they have the lowest status in Hawaii, the highest poverty rate among all groups in Hawaii. When it comes to racist stereotyping and representations, I'm sure you've heard racist slurs, jokes made about Micronesians that compare them to leeches, cockroaches. This is an example of the especially dehumanizing racism that they encounter in Hawaii. They're not even viewed as fellow human beings. They're denied a common humanity with the rest of us. There is a special status that Kanaka Maoli have in Hawaii that differs from every other group that John Osorio was emphasizing in his that we just heard, because this was their homeland, their home nation, and they suffered the overthrow of the monarchy. So the subordination that they experienced can be compared to colonialism. Once Europeans and Americans came to Hawaii and took over the government. This, another term for this kind of colonialism is called settler colonialism, insofar as these various groups not just moved to Hawaii, but they also settled here, including Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans, and assumed control of the state of Hawaii. So loss of sovereignty and of land are very different experiences for Native Hawaiians compared to all the other groups that came to Hawaii initially as plantation workers. So I'll end with a Senate resolution that was introduced this past session by 15 Democrats and the only Republican in our state Senate. And as you can see here, it reaffirms the state's commitment to ending systemic racism and injustice. And it calls on every Hawaii government institution and organization to lead by example to attain this goal. But it was not adopted, even though the Democrats control the Senate. And I'm not sure why. Perhaps they're overreaching with this goal about ending systemic racism throughout. But it's that second part of the sentence that you see here that I think is most significant for your diocese, to lead by example in addressing these persisting problems of racism and injustice. And the first step might be to address racial reconciliation, to think of ways, perhaps you thought of ways in this morning's discussion group, and you can continue those discussions in this afternoon. What are the ways that your diocese can lead by example to establish, to take these steps rather, to attain racial reconciliation? And especially, again, repeating what John Osorio mentioned, as a religious organization, you should be guided by those Christian values in this process. Although I will repeat what I said this morning, even though the United Church of Christ embarked on this very difficult process, it was not easy. They had resistance from within their organization, from members of their clergy who expressed opposition, need for reconciliation, or the need for reparations on the part of their churches. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Okamura. You've given us, again, a lot to think about. And now I'd like to open the space for Dr. Glenn. So Dr. Glenn, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you. I'll just take a moment to share my screen with you all again. Here we are. So I have the somewhat unenviable position of following Dr. Okamura, who gave us a lot of context, and also the Osorios earlier, who I think really helped us understand both the human impacts and the cultural impacts of racism here in Hawaii. And a lot of our conversation today has been addressing the quiet part, right? We've been saying the quiet part out loud and really trying to bring some light to some dark corners of our community that nonetheless shape the way that we interface with each other and the opportunities that individuals and communities in Hawaii society have access to. So this question of why don't we talk about race in Hawaii is to be answered by several things. One of them is that when we start to ask these questions, the answers are very confounding and they implicate many of us. Including those of us who are marginalized people or racialized people in other spaces. And I think the thing that's really important to understand, existence of race in Hawaii is not separate from global formations of race, and especially racial capitalism, which is the economic system that has spurred the spread of white supremacy and racism as a justification for economic moves. And this is an example. I mentioned this particular article. It was somewhat of a touchstone in the last few years for our community because of this research that was shared on a global platform like the New York Times that seemed to get a lot wrong about the actual day-to-day reality of Hawaii. So this is a community markup. Someone actually took that headline and edited it after it was published, and really emphasizes the idea that, there's a lot happening here that we need to be honest about before we can start advertising Hawaii to the rest of the world as some place that has gotten it right. And I think one of the things that's important for us to remember is that this idea of Hawaii as a racial paradise or racial utopia that sometimes people in our own community here repeat comes from not only, as Dr. Okamura pointed us to, this kind of rhetoric that was developed in the early 20th century in the territorial period, but also this rhetoric that revives itself in Obama's explanation of his childhood and context, but also in contrast to the racial reality in North America. So Hawaii is often held up as a place where everyone gets along. In this particular article, the supposition was that so many of us here in Hawaii are mixed race. And so that somehow truncates the existence of racism. And we know that if we look at plantation societies around the world, including where I come from in the US South, where many of us are mixed. I myself come from a diverse genealogy. That does not preclude racism, and it doesn't preclude the kinds of violence and economic victimization that is directed to people who are marginalized in a racist hierarchy. So I think part of the answer to this question of why we don't talk about race in Hawaii is one, that it's very complicated and has been developed along a Black-white binary that doesn't hold here. And we also don't talk about it because it's very convenient for those in power to not reckon with the ways that our lives have been structured around this racial hierarchy. So a couple of years ago, a community organization called Affirm, they're a feminist organization that was started in the Philippines and is now spread around the world, released this image where they took a census of sorts, looking at organizations in Hawaii that were run by white men, and they experienced a tremendous backlash. Now, no one refuted the fact that what they were saying was true. They simply were upset that they were calling attention to this and bringing attention to the fact that though Hawaii is incredibly diverse in terms of ethnic identity and certainly in terms of income and class status, that we still have a very small percentage and a very small segment of our community who is directing the structures that make our lives happen on a day-to-day, and those structures that generate and make profit from this place. It's very important. So a lot of the conversation, certainly in the last year, has focused on this concept of diversity as something that we should be striving for, and inclusion and equity as a part of this. Sometimes it's made into an acronym, DEI. Sometimes they add a J on there for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I would like for us, especially as we're thinking about what reconciliation might mean here in Hawaii, to trouble these ideas just a little bit. Of course, we're all aware what exclusion means. It means that people who create the structures that underpin our society and daily life, those who create those structures have excluded certain members who are still subject to them. We understand what segregation looks like. We have an idea sometimes of what integration looks like in inclusion. And so you might have seen images like this one that kind of model it out using these colored dots. So you have this idea of the colored dots on the outside moving into the center and then eventually being unfettered as they move around and mingle with the green dots in the center. So you might have a model that looks something like this as well. But we have this concept of belonging that people are starting to really lean into as we imagine, but also are honest about the ways that our society will have to be restructured. It will not be simply enough to have people move into positions of power that were predicated on inequality for many generations, but rather to acknowledge that there's opportunities for the structures themselves to be designed. And I think as we're considering reconciliation, it's not only going back to some kind of position of balance and détente that existed previously. When we're talking about race, we're talking about inequality from the beginning. We're talking about a structured hierarchy that has in its very DNA created and thrives off of inequality. And it requires us to think about that very directly and honestly if we actually want to pursue justice and restitution and reparation for the harm that race has inflicted on our communities. As Dr. Okamura was talking about public schools and private schools, Hawaii also has a long history that's not often talked about, thinking about our segregation system. We think of segregation as something that happened on the continent, and I do think that effectively we could talk about the public versus private school system here as evidence of segregation. And before that kind of codified itself, there were the English normal schools and English medium schools that contrasted with schools for children who were seen to need remedial help in speaking English because their parents were plantation workers and they spoke Pidgin. If you're interested in this history, I advise you to check out this film, which debuted on our local public television a few years ago. Also, as we think about race and reconciliation, there's an opportunity to recontextualize what we think we know about how race works here in Hawaii. So my organization is called Po'opola Project, and we use the Hawaiian word that has been applied to people of African descent and other Black people in this specific region. And part of what we are hoping to do is help our larger community in hearing that word and hearing our name to think about the relationship between race, inclusion, and exclusion, and being a part of the larger ecosystem of Hawaii in terms that take us outside of just the white supremacist connotations of Blackness and Black community. I'm going to skip this, but I want to invite you guys to check out this video from Pidgin to the Max, which was on TV in 1988, where a product that was advertised as Popolo suntan lotion starts to point us in the direction of how Hawaii has wrestled with the idea of inclusion and its diversity. And we're living in a Hawaii that also has artifacts like this one. This is something that was shared with me in a job many years ago, maybe 20 years ago or more, that someone was sharing as a funny kind of in-group, office joke that had been, as you can see, it's been reproduced many, many times. And the fact that this is something that's still circulating in community spaces and workplaces, something that we have to look at very squarely and ask some really deep and probing questions. If you look at this set of kind of joking questions for this job application, you can see a lot of stereotypes and a lot of violence embedded in the language here. And you also start to see that there is a particular set of cultural groups that are represented as those who are marginalized and dehumanized in these things. And certainly, as Dr. Okamura was pointing us to, we see that in the way that people from the Kofa nations have been treated here in Hawaii on a daily basis. Certainly, as people talk about Hawaii being different from North America, we still find some of the racial vocabulary of North America here. These are two Black employees at Hawaiian Airlines and at the Queens Medical Center who both were harassed by coworkers who left nooses in their lockers or in public spaces that they thought they would see. So even though we don't have the same history of lynching and the racial violence that was directed to Black people really reaching a fever pitch in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that vocabulary has traveled here in Hawaii and is part of the conversation and part of the arsenal of racial battery that's not only directed to Black people, but I would also argue extends to people like Micronesians, who, though they are not Black themselves, the kind of racialized hatred that is directed to us spills over, and that vocabulary is extended to them. So in the same way that they're called cockroaches or dehumanized, that comes from a facility and practice of dehumanizing people of African descent in the Atlantic world, now imported into the Pacific. Certainly last summer, we saw that Hawaii, like many other places, joined in this global conversation on anti-Blackness and the kinds of work that we need to do to be really honest about the society that we live in. This is an example. These are two kind of contrasting images from June 2020. On the right is a placard that was at Black Lives Matter marches here in Honolulu. We had almost 10,000 people show up, where someone, the person who created this sign, sees a linkage between George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and all the people who were killed last year, Trayvon Martin and Joseph Kahahawaii and Colin Elderts, two Hawaiian men who were killed in different circumstances, but also the creator of this sign saw a connection in the way that these people had all been racialized and deemed as available for extrajudicial killing. On the left is a contrasting image, however, that was circulating last summer as people were contrasting the Hawaiian sovereignty movement and the demonstrations in support of the protection of Mauna Kea and other land-based struggles here in Hawaii. And they were contrasting the right way, which they saw as cultural, and the wrong way, trying to find a contrast, a stark contrast between the ways that Black people and others on North America were in the streets and protesting many centuries, really, of racialized violence directed at them. We also saw people who came out and saw this as an opportunity for solidarity last summer. There were lots of protests here and all around the world that dug into those cultural connections and the humanizing work that's required for us to do any kind of racialization rewind. So this question of what do we need and why do we need a new vocabulary for talking about race in Hawaii. I think there are going to be several things in addition to policy moves and these kind of moments of official reconciliation. We're also going to have to start thinking about what it means to be local, what it means to be part of this community, and what it means to truly belong. We'll have to think about who is a perpetual foreigner and why, and whose interest does it serve. We'll have to think about very critically and honestly about what it means for us to be in a place occupied militarily by the United States, culturally American and with American domination in so much of our daily lives, when there is an existing indigenous population who has valid claims to this land. And so this opens up questions about what it means for any of us to be settlers here, and what it means for us to belong, and ultimately what is our responsibility or what is our kuleana to each other. And so I'll leave you with this, thinking about this long history of the formation of race that did not start in Hawaii, it started someplace else on the planet many, many hundreds of years ago. What would we build if we really thought of ourselves at this crucial time as stewards of this moment? And what kinds of cultures and institutions will be in our wake in the next 500 years? I think all of the speakers have spoken to that in different ways today. And I hope that as you continue as a church community to wrestle with this and think about your particular positions and resources that you have to lend to the struggle, that you'll have some creative and generative ideas about how to answer this question. Mahalo.
Thank you, Dr. Glenn. Wonderful. And thank you, Dr. Okamura, as well, for, again, giving us much, much, much to think about and to work through. We're just so grateful that both of you have made time for us today, and we're willing to share your expertise with all of us for the day. And again, just so grateful. And it's been an incredible, breakout rooms, the one I was in at least, spurred some very good conversations for us. And so, we have another one coming up this afternoon, which I believe will continue to create great dialogue with us and challenge us and stretch us to move forward in ways suggested by both of you as well as the Osorios. And so thank you again. So dear friends, we have a break time right now. It's going to be a break for us, about a 15-minute break until 12:55. And after that break, please come back to this main room and we will set you out into the breakout rooms. And our apologies if any of you experience any difficulties in your breakout rooms this morning. Technology, we're learning and we're growing as we use this format of ours, and it's a gift in a lot of ways for us to be able to gather in this way during this time, and it is a challenge as well to make sure it all works well. So thank you for your patience with us as we have figured all of this out. And again, we'll be on break for a bit. And again, Dr. Okamura, Dr. Glenn, thank you so much for your time and your expertise today.
Excuse me, I was just wondering if we can get a list of email addresses for attendees.
We have not asked, it's my tendency to not share people's email address unless I've had permission for it. So we can reach out to everyone to see if they would like, if they'd be willing to share.
Well, A very simple request. I have a cartoon I would like to send to Jazzy. So it's not a big deal.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Thanks, Sandy.
You can certainly send it to us and we'll make sure she gets it if she's not back in the time. I think her group is just still finishing.
You get my epistle, right? Every week.
Oh, well, actually, she just added her email in the chat, I believe.
Okay, so, oh, good. Thank you, Jazzy. This past week, the cartoon in the epistle is one that's very germane to what Jazzy was just talking about.
Ah, okay. Well, I think we're all back, so I will come back and folks can give it back to Jazzy and Andrew.
Thank you. I hope all of you had beautiful, open-hearted, fruitful discussions. We certainly did. This is the end of our Education Day. Thank you for staying with us, for making the time in your day to spend hours unending on Zoom. I hope that your heart has been opened to something new, that you've learned something, that Spirit is convicting you in some way of how we are going to move forward into a more true vision of God's kingdom, into a more beloved community. I just want to invite all of you, any of you who are interested in joining the work of the Reconciliation Task Force, please reach out. Let either myself or Andrew know. I think I put my email in the chat, and there we go.
I have it up right now, Jazzy.
Great. There's mine and there's Andrew's. We are co-chairs of the Reconciliation Task Force. We have, as you know, some big questions to wrestle with of how we are called forward as a diocese, how we might reckon with our history and reconcile that into something that God dreams for us. If you are called into this work, or if you think someone else might be, maybe who is here today or maybe who is not, please nudge them. Please let them know that Spirit might be calling them into this and get in touch with us. We would love to add to our group. Andrew, do you have anything to add as we wrap up?
I want to echo your words of thank you for everyone for spending the day with us. It was quite moving and informative, and I'm so grateful that we had the time in the small groups with everyone and the kind of conversations that came out of our time together. And it and I want to echo what Jazzy said is if any of you are interested or being called to be a part of our Reconciliation Task Force, please reach out. And you know, we're hoping to carry on into 2022 and beyond, holding on a vision that we create that can inform the work that we're doing for the diocese and for Hawaii and for the world. And so, yeah, thank you so much.
I think Anake Kala is going to offer our closing prayer. And so hopefully there she is.
There she is.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Pulikako. Accept, O Lord, our thanks for this day and for the living of it. We thank you also for the reconciliation wisdom that has been imparted and received today. In all humility, we now ask that your holy and life-giving Spirit help us to move barriers which divide us, make suspicions disappear, and stop the hatred, so that when our divisions are healed, we will live in unity and peace together. Lord, you have bound us together in a common life. Help us in the midst of our struggles for justice and truth to confront one another without hatred or bitterness, and to work together with mutual forbearance and respect. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amene mahalo. And I think we have our dismissal from Jeannie Cooper.
Let us go forth rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit, who equips us to do justice, show mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Alleluia.
Alleluia.
Hallelujah.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Mahalo, everyone.
Mahalo.
Mahalo.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
T and Andrew and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
To
everyone.
Tomorrow.